Rothermo's added testimony is that beyond point 8, the fire had to be going about 5 times as fast as at point 6, 660 feet per minute or 7.5 miles per hour. At point 8, too many questions remain to stop now and try to get answers to all of them. The central and most bitter of these questions was the fire that cremated the Smokejumpers the main fire, or did the foreman's escape fire keep its advanced position and reach the Smokejumpers first? Let us first accompany those yet to die as far as we can before making the escape fire stand trial, as undoubtedly it should before it finds its resting place in history. 5. From the escape fire to the furthest cross, as we measure the remaining distances and times, we can divide our problem like the grave markers into 2 discernible tiers. The front runners, led by the Four Horsemen who were within a minute of reaching the top, and those on the lower tier who, after passing Dodge at his escape fire, seemingly just went on side-hilling, but without the strength to climb any longer. There were no fundamental differences, however, in the fire conditions the 2 tiers faced. The official transcript describes the fuels in this area around point 8 as chiefly cheatgrass and fescue. Rothermo says, I assume it to be equally divided between fuel models 1 and 3. Model 1 is the light fuel model. It describes cheatgrass very well. Model 3 is a heavier grass model that should account for the fescue, weeds, and brush in the area. The fuel moisture calculates to be very close to 3%, a very low value. Probably the worst problem was the very strong wind that was gusting to 40 miles per hour in the open. It was probably scouring close to the ground, giving mid-flames winds of 15 to 20 miles per hour. Rothermo's description of the fire conditions continues until it leads to his projection of how soon the men on the lower tier, and presumably the slowest among the front runners, died. With these conditions, and estimating the fuel was divided equally between fuel models 1 and 3, the fire is estimated to have been spreading at 660 feet per minute, with flames ranging from 10 to 40 feet in length. At this rate, I estimate the slowest men were caught in 45 seconds. At 5:56, just 100 yards from Dodge, the rate of these men over this last 100 yards figures to have been near 400 feet per minute, or about 4.5 miles per hour. That is a remarkable speed for the slowest of the fastest to maintain, especially if they lost some time at the escape fire trying to understand what Dodge was saying to them. One other piece of on-the-spot evidence was used in arriving at this calculation of their speed. Dodge's statement to the Board of Review that it would take the fire no more than 30 seconds or 100 yards to catch the tail end of the crew side-hilling past him. Those at the head of the line who came within a minute of the top of the ridge came close to taking us to the edge of reality. We have referred to them as the Four Horsemen. Let them remain as such to the end. The average distance of their crosses from Dodge's escape fire is 375 yards. Rothermo theorizes that for them to get this far, they were not with Dodge when he started his fire, but rather began their strong push at point 7. There is first-hand evidence that, for one of them, this was the case. Salih says in his second official statement made on December 12, 1951, that, quote, I had noticed Novan cut off up the hill away from the crew just before we broke out of the timber, and had noticed him rejoin the crew. No doubt, for we have seen before that when the former parachute jumper from Bastogne didn't like the way things were going in the United States Forest Service, he took matters into his own hands. But I can find no mention among the statements made about the fire by any of its survivors of the individual conduct of the other 3 front-runners. And I am inclined to think that the other front-runners stayed with the bunch but outran them, and that one of them, Henry Thal, outran Novan. If Rothermo is right that the front-runners began their push at point 7, they traveled about 600 yards to the site of their grave markers. He projects that their rate of travel from point 7 would average 460 feet per minute, or 5.25 miles per hour. However, if the possibility I am inclined to believe is correct, if the other 3 left Dodge at point 8, and if we allow them 15 seconds or so to watch him start his fire, then they would have traveled 375 yards in about 2 minutes before the fire caught up to them. That is 562 feet per minute, or 6.5 miles per hour. As Rothermal goes on to say, that is a slow jogging pace and would have been almost beyond reality to maintain for 375 yards on a slope where I had to crawl with gloved hands on a hot August afternoon. All of us have the privilege to choose what we wish to visualize as the edge of reality. Either tier of crosses allows us to picture the dead as dying with their boots on some of the bodies all but the boots were burned off. If you have lived a life that has thrown you in contact many times with nature, you have already discovered that sometimes you can deal with nature only by allowing it to push back what until now you and others thought were its edges. No one who survived saw what happened to those who became crosses on that hillside. Until the fire had passed, Dodge lay face down in the ashes of his fire, gasping into his wet handkerchief. Rumsey and Salih were later to testify that as they escaped up the side of the hill after leaving Dodge, there were long flames and engulfing smoke most of the way, but that 2 or 3 times the smoke lifted for a moment. Something like this is probably how it will be with us to the end of our Man Gulch story. Outcroppings of reality will come to us only in glimpses, as they came to Rumsey and Salih, but I know what all along I have been waiting to see. In the Forest Service reports issued after the fire, there is scarcely a see you later alligator farewell for the 13 men who were killed. When Dodge was asked at the Board of Review if any of those about to die looked his way as they went by, the foreman replied, "They didn't seem to pay any attention. That's the part I didn't understand. They seemed to have something on their minds, all headed in one direction." The last Salih could recall seeing them, they were angling up the slope in the unburned grass and fairly close to the edge of the fire Dodge had set. Then the smoke and the great ambiguity settled in, but I expect to see more. I have long expected to catch glimpses of them as far as they went. You could expect less from a boy who grew up in the woods and grew old as a school teacher, and so spent most of his life staying close to the young who are elite and select and, by definition, often in trouble. I came to Man Gulch expecting to catch glimpses of them as far as they could go, and that's why I came. The fire had gained on the crew at every stage of the race until even the fastest had to fall. For a moment only the Four Horsemen were higher up on the hill and still alive, and for only a part of that moment would they see tragedy was among them. You can see tragedy coming from a considerable distance when you are older, but when you're young, tragedy does not pertain to you and certainly never catches up to you. There are pieces of premonitions of tragedy floating around, but they do not yet add up to your tragedy. There are separate stabs of fear, of pity, of self-pity, but to a degree in separate parts of the body. Then suddenly they all merge into one sense, the encompassing sense of inevitability. It is everywhere on you as it becomes the essential whole of all that is preparing to be your tragedy. It becomes the cause of your mounting fear, your pity, and your self-pity, telling you that no matter what, it does no good to be proud and good and young. Then almost at the end it makes possible triumph that can come at the end of tragedy for the young who are select and elite. The triumph of retaining your pride when you know you have lost for good before you have had a chance in life to make good, except for this. From the elevation of retrospect, we can see it all coming together more clearly and sooner than those who were there and running. For us, the signs are many that in minutes the blow-up would bring a total convergence of sky, young men, and fire. And after that the dark. On the top of the hill, though, there were only occasional partings in the smoke, and the flames themselves were blinding, and those inside the flames and smoke could no longer see what was happening to them and would happen next. We would not have started to follow the course of wildfire if we had not assumed that all of us, when called upon, could view an earthly scene from imaginative perspective, something like the sky spirits in Thomas Hardy's poetical drama, The Dynasts, who comment upon tragedies of man from distant horizons. The title of another of Hardy's finest poems, The Convergence of the Twain, suggests convergences yet to come in Man Gulch. Hardy's convergence is between the elite, brightly lit and fastest ship of its time, the Titanic, with an iceberg moving inexorably out of a solitude of the sea, deep from human vanity. We can set aside the difference between the ice of the poem and the fire of the story. From the beginning of the world, either way has been taken as the way the world may end. And surely there is little philosophic difference between the convergence of fire and ice. Alien they seem to be, no mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history. or sign that they were bent by paths coincident on being a non-twins halves of one August event, till the spinner of the years said, now. There is, however, a mathematical difference between the perspective from a distant horizon and the view from the ground. From the ground, our approach in tragedy, like the Titanic's, had been linear, arithmetic, and two-dimensional. From the ground, it had occurred on one line as behind caught up to ahead. But the spinner of the years, viewing wildfire and young men from an even more distant horizon than our own, would see geometry as well as arithmetic in what was occurring at lower elevations. Not just geometry, but solid geometry, lines becoming curves and curves closing into circles and circles blowing up into spherical monsters, whirling burning branches into the sky, and for a short time, a very short time, a thin line moving among those expanding solids. At the appropriate moment, when the spinner of the years said now, Salih crawled through the crevice 170 yards above where he had left Dodge and took a good look back. He was the only survivor who stopped just to look. Although Salih was not on a distant horizon and did not have the complete view of the spinner of years, he saw 3 and possibly 4 geometries of fire, below and above him, above being almost beside him, and possibly ahead of him in the head of the gulch, already filling up with smoke. And certainly behind him were 2 fires. Man Gulch's 2 famous fires, the main one only 50 yards or less down gulch, and in front of it, the escape fire. In fact, he saw all the preconditions of a tragedy only moments away without realizing it was imminent and inevitable and tragic. Both he and Rumsey, after the fire had passed the rock slide where they had taken refuge, thought that the rest of the crew were probably as safe as they were. Maybe you have to be born with a special sense of the inevitable to see it coming. On a big fire, fire could be everywhere, but you can't look everywhere or your problem gets unmanageable. Rumsey kept the problem simple by looking only for the top of the hill and nothing else, and he got there. Only Salih saw the lower edge of the main fire pass below the lower end of Dodge's escape fire, but evidently he thought it was a stray stream of fire and didn't let it bother him by thinking it might be a killer. The fire as it existed in his mind was something behind them that had jumped from the lower end of the opposite side of the gulch and was still behind them. No matter who you are, it is hard to adjust yourself to the fact that a forest fire is not all a big roar behind you getting closer. A dangerous part of it is very sneaky and may actually have sneaked ahead of you or is trying to and doesn't roar until it's about to close in on you. The fire that had jumped to the north side of the gulch had also been sneaking up gulch in the dense timber on the south side where it began, rolling burning cones downhill and setting spot fires until in the semi-darkness something invisible touched something else invisible, and suddenly there was a fire front surrounding the head of the gulch. In a few minutes, the head of the gulch descended into the lower circles of its own inferno, and the blow-up became complete in Man Gulch. It was about this time that Ranger Jansen, looking up Man Gulch from the river, saw that the upper end of the gulch had disappeared into one vast flame. By then, the fire passing below the lower end of Dodge's fire, which looked like behind to Salih, had moved straight up gulch and merged with the fires that had become ahead in a great flame. As the head was already disappearing in one flame out of the gulch, below was soon to be above as well as behind and ahead. It was not just a convergence of the twain, but a quatrain, for above surely was rolling his torches downhill to meet the main fire spreading up from below. We are beyond where arithmetic can explain what was happening in the piece of nature that had been the head of Man Gulch. Converging geometries had created something invisible like suction to carry off a natural explanation of the attraction of geometries to each other. In between these geometries, for something like 4 minutes, was a painfully moving line with pieces of it dropping out until there came an end to biology. Then there was pure geometry, and later still the solid geometry of concrete crosses. There has been no final account as yet of the escape fire started by the foreman of the Forest Service. It is time now that there should be. Near the end of the many tragedies, it seems right that there should be moments when the story stops and looks back for something it left behind, and finds it because of things it learned. As it were, by having lived through the story, the things found can be relatively small things, such as this thing, but also they can be big. But usually they are announced by minor characters, and generally they are about nature. We are so often wrong about nature that it comes as a relief of some kind to be right about it. especially after there's been some great disruption in it. Such moments of relief near the end of tragedy must be important parts of what from classical times has been called the purgation of tragedy. At times it seems as if tragedy tries at the end to take away some of its own tragedy, and if some tragedies never restore our stability, at least most of them allow us some success in struggling to attain some stability on our own. In my family, some such meaning was attached to the phrase, saved by grace. The remaining pages of this tragedy are its purgation, and they come by grace. In my family, what happens on Sundays is foreordained. What comes on weekdays comes from something within us, and for which we are responsible. And if it is from something deep within us, it's called grace, and is. The Man Gulch fire would never have attained its preeminence in the history of forest fires if Foreman Wag Dodge had not set his escape fire. It made the Man Gulch fire a lasting mystery story, unlike much larger tragic forest fires that were open and shut affairs, buried forever with only one interpretation. With only one interpretation, a forest fire soon becomes a statistic. But the Man Gulch fire was not only a tragedy, but a mystery story of physical and intellectual dimensions, introducing mistaken identities and explanations accompanied by seemingly unanswerable scientific questions. The mistaken identities and explanations start with Dodge's fire. Sallee and Rumsey, the first to encounter it, mistakenly judged it to be a buffer fire. To Dodge, it was indeed intended to protect the crew from the main fire, but he intended that the men should lie face down in its ashes with him and let the main fire burn over him. To those Dodge tried to persuade to lie down in the hot ashes with him, Dodge's fire seemed unintelligible. Strategically, all they could see was that he had started a fire even closer to them than the main fire. Who knows what they thought of him as a character? They may have thought he had panicked and gone nuts, or at least had lost his guts and turned chicken, and only 200 yards from the top. We have already encountered some of the bitterness aroused by the so-called escape fire in the hearts of those in the world outside who had been close to those who died by the crosses. As we know, the most bitter was Henry Thal's father, of the jumper whose cross is closest to the top, who thought Dodge's setting a fire in front of the main fire was a homicidally incompetent act. It had killed his boy and other jumpers who were close to the top and prevented others down the hill from escaping the only way that may still have been open to them. It is only right for us to have Henry Thal Sr. state again his case against the Forest Service, and Dodge reminding ourselves that, as a retired Forest Service ranger, he was the only first-class woodsman among the plaintiffs. When Dodge set this fire, he didn't know what he was doing. Indications on the ground show quite plainly that his own fire caught up with some of the boys up there above him. His own fire prevented those below him from going to the top. The poor boys were caught. They had no escape. End of quote. Lurking in Thal's charges is a test that could have been applied to determine their validity, but would have had to be applied immediately while the evidence was still fresh and discernible. Thal and Carl A. Gustafson, chief of the Division of Fire Control in Washington, both testified for opposite reasons at the Board of Review that it was easy to follow the outline of Dodge's fire on the hillside, since it burned with much less intensity than the main fire. Powerful evidence if it appeared as clear on the hill as it sounds in court. Why then didn't at least one of these leading exponents of opposite conclusions challenge the other to return immediately to Man Gulch with a jury of experienced and impartial woodsmen to study the outline of Dodge's fire before autumn rains and winter snow made mud of the evidence? Big talk, but no follow-up. Maybe those outlines of Dodge's fire weren't as clear on the ground as the witnesses said they were. There is another test, of course, that should allow the hillside to reveal the role Dodge's fire played in the tragedy. Gustafson, who was designated by the chief forester to conduct the first investigation of the Man Gulch fire, and who before even seeing the gulch was worried about whether Dodge's fire had killed the men, almost immediately recognized the two questions to which right answers could clear the Forest Service of negligence. The two questions were directed again and again to Rumsey and Sallee. One, did you keep to the up-gulch side of Dodge's fire on your race to the crevice after leaving Dodge? And two, was the crevice where you passed to safety straight or almost straight above where you left Dodge? If Rumsey and Sallee were in front of Dodge's fire and still were able to run almost straight to the top of the ridge, Dodge's fire could not have caught the crew angling up gulch. In their testimony, Rumsey and Salih more and more agreed that Dodge's fire would straight up slope, but they were young and were under pressure from officials of the Forest Service to agree to what Ranger Jansen scornfully referred to as the established version of what had happened. Their increasing agreement needed the support of other evidence, and certainly of evidence on the ground, so almost from the beginning of our serious study of the Man Gulch fire, Laird Robbins and I realized that a positive location of the crevice and the site where Dodge and his crew had separated at his fire would be central to a determination of much of what happened in the final acts of the tragedy, including the role of Dodge's fire. Properly locating the lower end of Dodge's fire not only was essential to reconstructing the story of the Man Gulch fire, but became something of a story in itself. A quest story obstructed by staggering heat and rattlesnakes looking for holes in which to cool off. This quest story ended happily with Laird and me, led on by a long forgotten photograph, coming to a place in dead grass where a wooden cross had fallen. What is more, the wooden cross pointed us to a new crevice in the reef above, and at the far end of the crevice to a juniper bush. From this crevice you could do what Salih did, turn and look back, and see that you climbed not exactly straight up, but close enough to straight up to regard the location of the crevice and the site where Dodge lit his fire as evidence heavily in support of the testimony of the survivors that the fire set by Dodge did not burn his crew. Indeed, the primary witnesses, Rumsey, Salih, the wooden cross, and the crevice, seem so nearly in complete agreement that it's hard not to imagine them irritably demanding, "What more do you want? Why isn't our agreement conclusive proof?" But a major trouble remains. The agreement among witnesses seems to contradict nature. How can two large fires only 50 yards apart burn in two different directions, one almost directly across the front of the other? The question is made more difficult by the fact that one fire must have been at something approaching maximum speed and intensity, a blow-up contributing to its own wind and moving up the gulch with enough speed steadily to gain on the crew, whereas the other fire had started just minutes before and could not have been burning with much intensity. Yet this newer, weaker fire seemingly had in its weakness enough power to free itself from the forces that controlled the main fire and go off on its own, defiantly burning across the front of the main fire. Why, when the two fires were almost one, didn't the forces controlling the more powerful fire also control the weaker one? This is one of those tough spots where either our facts are wrong or we don't know enough about the subject to explain them. Out of deference to our witnesses and ourselves, and because we don't like to start out by admitting we were wrong, let us assume at first that there is nothing seriously wrong with what we know, namely the testimony and the ground, and that, therefore, to explain what we know, we have to put aside some of what we think we already know about nature, which does not contradict itself, but just is, even if it blows up and goes in two different directions at once. Nature in this case is an action of two wildfires as they approach each other, one much stronger than the other. More precisely, therefore, we may not know enough about the factors of nature determining the direction and speed of wildfires, chiefly fuels, the direction and velocity of the wind, and the slope or pitch of the ground. However, a good look at the ground and the general area where this phenomenon occurred reduces these three possibilities to one. There was no appreciable difference between the fuels the two fires were burning that would cause the fires to burn in different directions. For instance, Dodge's fire had no rock slide on its up gulch side that would have turned the fire straight up slope, no thick stand of timber, nothing like that. Both fires were burning in dry, waist-high grass for practical purposes in the same grass. Likewise, there is no appreciable difference in the grade of the slope on which they were burning. Dodge's fire was not burning on a suddenly steep pitch on the hillside, and the main fire had not come to a depression or plateau, the combined effect of which might have sent Dodge's fire much more upslope than the main fire. The slope they were both burning on was very steep and would certainly have been an upslope influence on both fires, but whereas that influence was the same on both fires, it was not great enough to deter the main fire from moving quickly up gulch and soon passing over and out of the head of the gulch. That leaves the wind as the leading suspect, although it doesn't come easy to picture the wind blowing the main fire one way and the new fire defiantly across its front as the two fires came together. That's the picture, though, we seem to be left with. If the wind was responsible for such an action, it would be natural to think that the main up-gulch wind suddenly changed direction and burned up slope, then turned back and burned up gulch again, and this is what Salih thought must have happened. In his statement to the Forest Service investigator said, There apparently was quite a high wind blowing straight up the slope at the time Dodge set the fire, because that fire spread very rapidly straight up the slope and only slowly sideways of the slope. No doubt the state of knowledge about fire behavior at the time was such that nearly all firefighters familiar with the Man Gulch fire would have had no other explanation to offer, but it is highly unlikely with a sudden shift in wind would completely control the direction of Dodge's fire and leave untouched the main fire only a few yards away, which in a few seconds would pass around the lower end of Dodge's fire to continue up Gulch. It is much more likely that the reason why Dodge's fire went straight for the top of the ridge is also one of the reasons not generally understood at the time of the fire, that converging fires can explode into a blow-up. And this modern explanation of the causes of these two natural phenomena, a blow-up and two fires going in different directions, the Man Gulch fire with the passing of time comes to explain itself and helps to explain other things like it. An explanation of the blow-up that jumped the lower end of the gulch and pursued the crew up Gulch depends upon understanding not only of prevailing winds approaching a promontory, but of the wind effect created when two bodies of air of unequal temperature approach each other. That effect may more easily recalled if it's called a convection effect. A fire can set up a whirling action by drawing the cooler and heavier air from the outside into the vacuum left by its own hotter and lighter air, constantly rising and escaping. In case this seems like a theoretical and theatrical construction, you might go to your basement furnace when it's roaring and open its door, put your face in front of it, feel with sudden alarm that you are about to be drawn into your own furnace. The problem then of the direction Dodge's fire took finally comes down to the question of which way or ways the wind blows when two fires approach each other, one more intense than the other. Something like a big tug-of-war between two winds would have to take place to control Dodge's fire. The two winds being the prevailing wind that was driving the main fire up Gulch, and an opposite down Gulch wind the main fire had generated by drawing to itself heavier, cooler air to fill the vacuum caused by its hotter, lighter air rising and escaping. If the two fires had been at a distance from each other, the secondary down Gulch wind would have had little effect on Dodge's fire. But as the main fire drew closer to Dodge and his men, its effect would have increased until a moment came when the up Gulch and down Gulch winds approached equal force. At that moment of relative equilibrium between opposing winds, a moment of relative calm would have fallen on the slope where Dodge struck his match, and one match could burn long enough to start a fire. You can safely bet that where and when Dodge lit his fire with a single gopher match, there was no wind blowing 30 miles an hour. In that moment of calm, when the two counter winds neutralized each other and so roughly eliminated wind as a major factor in determining the direction of Dodge's fire, the hitherto lesser force of the steepness of the slope took over, and Dodge's fire, now under the slope's influence, burned straight or almost straight up slope. At that moment, the survivors, the ground, the fires, and the winds were all in agreement. That is to say, testimony and nature were in agreement, and nature, while seeming to act unnaturally, was actually in agreement with all parts of itself. But the moment of the equilibrium of the counter winds could not have lasted long. What then? The answer is that the convergence of all these convergences in another few minutes completed itself into total conflagration at the head of Man Gulch. Already the lower branch of the main fire had swept around the lower end of Dodge's fire, and roaring up Gulch and upslope was closing in on the crew from below. Threatening the crew from above was the fire burning up Gulch on top of the ridge. Now behind them were two other fires about to converge, the main fire that was pursuing them up Gulch and the fire Dodge had lit that was now for the moment burning roughly at right angles to the direction of the main fire, but soon would be taken over by the main fire and be propelled with it toward the head of the Gulch, one indistinguishable from the other. No wonder neither Gustafson nor Thal offered to take the other or an impartial jury back to Man Gulch to find the lighter outline of Dodge's fire. With fires by now jumping over or sweeping around each other or overpowering each other, there couldn't have been much left of outlines. The fire burning along the top of the ridge may have kept pace with the angling crew below and forced them farther and farther up Gulch. It may have been the front of Dodge's fire, turning toward the head of the Gulch after reaching the top of the ridge. More likely, it was the upper branch of the main fire, or as the convergence approached completion, both fires combined. When the survivors in Laird and I were in Band Gulch in 1978, we split our 4 votes among these 3 alternatives, with each of us willing to admit he might be wrong and could never be sure that he was right. But in the conflagration that was about to occur, no component any longer had any individual responsibility, for the simple reason that in a moment there were no individual components, just conflagration. What was happening was passing beyond legality and morality and seemingly beyond the laws of nature, blown into a world where human values and seemingly natural laws no longer apply. Such moments can occur the world over, sometimes even at home as well as on hillsides. The Man Gulch fire was passing beyond issues and settlements into a world of pictures, perhaps more exactly into thoughts that pictorialize and feel and cannot reduce themselves to numbers. These are pictures made largely by us, the amateur artists, who are always making pictures inside our heads that spring from our hearts.